Jantric Konto presents Grim Repast, Warhammer 40,000. By Marc Collins. Chapter 1. Reconsecration of Purpose. There was darkness, and there was pain, neither of which were new. Sensations to kill yon Drask. The metal of the gurney was cold against his back, as uncomfortable as any apothecarian he had previously experienced. He realized now, at last, why he had taken so long to bring himself to this moment. The fear of being seen to be weak, or vulnerable, or simply being thought of as lax in his dedication to the job. The darkness faded as he opened his eye. He could only see out of one of them, his left, and was staring at the plain grey ceiling of Bastion PS. Medici wing. He found himself focusing on details that shouldn't matter. The cracks and ridges of the ceiling holding his attention as surely as any factorum. He felt as though he could reach out, and he would be able to touch it, just a little, to dig his fingers into the stuff of it. That would be the drugs, Killon, he thought, chiding himself. He tried to say, but a firm hand pushed him down hard against the steel. He could feel the augmetic implants in the fingers digging into him in warning. Is everything all right? He had wanted to ask, but she ignored him. The chirurgeon was masked and gloved, a plastic apron crinkling against her torso as she moved. Her focus was absolute, even as her fingers pressed into his shoulder. He watched what he could see of her features as she worked. The sharp blue of her cybernetic eye, burning in such stark contrast to her dark skin, and the pale green of the mask. Her other hand was working, slowly easing the blade of a scalpel across the back of his eyeball, testing the iris embedded image lattice. A network of scars and tech nestled there, like a forgotten secret. Drask tried not to wince, not to think too hard about the fact that his eyeball had been drawn out of its socket, held on only by the stretched cord of his optic nerve. Enucleation. The word came to him with a sick, sympathetic pop. The sort of word he had only seen before in reports, bound together in his mind with acts of utterly horrific violence. His breathing hitched as he willed himself not to panic. Not much longer, Killion, she said, with an almost maternal indulgence. You are doing very well. Everything seems in order with the implants. Update and reactivation should be a fairly simple procedure. Drask tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. The migraine pain behind his eyes, spasmed and burned, flexing its invisible tendrils as it permeated his brain. He could feel the urge to vomit, the acid sting of it rising in his throat to meet the pain in his skull. He bit it back. The web of suspensor wires bracing the orb tightened infinitesimally at his movements, the way a serpent calls around its prey. There were flickers of light across the clouded side of his vision, not sight resolving, merely the misfiring of nerve and machine. He did not blink. He could not. Instead, Drask could only watch as the light returned. Stronger. Clarity came, and with it a word in place of imagery. Interfacing. Drask heard the word, echoing in his mind in the bone-dry rasp of a servitor, but there was no voice. The machine spirit of the iris implant was re-energizing, connecting with the memetic system's whisper of the data whale. Functions that had long since atrophied were swelling once again into vital life, and his mind bore the trauma of the inload. His skin burned, itching, with contradictory feedback. "Not long now, Killion," she said from above him. Amelia Visserth looked down at him. He could sense the indulgent smile behind her mask, the gentle patronization in her words. Perhaps it was to calm him a little. Bedside manner, or perhaps it was for her own amusement. "You should be seeing the direct interface now." She looked away from him at some distant screen before looking back down at his sweating, strained features. "Talking isn't a good idea, so give me a nod if you can see it." He nodded, and she nodded back, pleased. She drew the scalpel blade away from the socket and the nerve, and he stopped feeling its gentle pressure upon the base of his eyeball. It was an almost impossible sensation to describe, made all the stranger by the slow pulse of the wire cradle. Amelia turned away, and the wires began to retract at some typed instruction. He felt the wet suction as his eye was lowered back into place. Vision returned slowly from out of the darkness of the optical disconnect. It was blurred at first. His eye had been kept misted, but even so it felt dry within its socket till the involuntary flood of tears came. He blinked them away, and the iris implant responded to his blinklicks avidly, starved from lack of use. "I will still never understand how you went so long on terminals alone, Killion." Amelia shook her head as she spoke. He smiled, wincing at the pain behind his eyes. His face, his entire musculature, felt as though it was still struggling to readjust. His skull felt somehow heavier, though he knew on some intrinsic level that it was simply his imagination. "You are one of the few people who actually use my given name, did you know that? You might have mentioned it before." Amelia placed her implements down, brushed her hands against her apron, and leant back in to examine his eye. "Settling nicely," she said, clicking her tongue. "I know that it hasn't always been your way, but a return to active duty was dependent upon you actively using the tools at your disposal." She looked down at his bare torso, at the long ragged scar across his abdomen. It had a sheen to it, a freshness. The cause of it, the much lamented cause. Amelia shook her head. Drask knew it hurt her as much as it did him. The sense of betrayal inherent in it. They had loved Alexius, each in their own way. Drask as a father, Amelia as a respected colleague and friend. Alexius Voigt had much to answer for, and had paid the price in the end. In many ways, Drask felt he was still paying for the sins and mistakes of the past. Drask blinked over and over as the writing clarified and the tracery of lines resolved themselves into the Eris interface patterns. Nests and webs of sigils unfurled like incantations, and he shook away the overlay. Old habits, years old, from when he had first taken the implant, re-established themselves with the ease of breathing. "I think it's working now," he said, not entirely convincingly. Amelia looked at him, sighed and shook her head. Her augmetic fingers cracked and whirred as they realigned. She took up the tools she had been using and placed them back on the tray with a frown. "If there are any complications, though, I expect Of course, Drask said, cutting her off. You'll be the first to know if it starts to burn its way through the back of my eyeball. Killion, she said. He could hear the caution in her voice. Even he knew where to draw the line with Amelia Wissert. There are any number of complications that could arise from the implant, especially after so long a period of disuse. Visual distortion, pain, blindness, audiovisual hallucination. All I'm asking is that you are careful. I know, he said contritely. I will be careful. But I trust your work. I wouldn't want anyone else digging around inside my skull. Something flickered in his eye, an eagerly flashing rune, crimson and insistent. He chuckled a little. Not that anyone else cares about my preferences. There is. He blink-clicked the symbol, and it unfolded out. A case already. Anything interesting? Amelia asked. Her tone was calm. Neutral. Drask knew her better than that, though. He could taste the interest just beneath the surface. Amelia had always had a morbid streak. Even in Alexia's day. Her passion for it was exceeded only by her knowledge, as though everything were a book to be read or a body to be rendered apart. Everything was secondary to that quest for understanding. Her desire verged upon obsession, known and visible only to those closest to her. Drask knew that feeling well, had felt it right beneath his skin, and he had learned it from the best. His gift, his knack, whatever names others threw at it, lay in seeing that hunger in others. Seeing where it thrived, or burned, or curdled. He scanned the unspooling information as it flowed down his eye. He shook his head. Nothing special. Homicide. Only blessing is that it's up district. A break from the worst of the cold then? Amelia chuckled. Keep me posted. If there is anything I can do to help, you know where I am. I will forward the body on to Bastion P, least I can do, considering. Drask waved his hand vaguely around his eye. Amelia shook her head and laughed softly. I appreciate the meager effort, Killion. Throne keep you. His hand. Drask did not nod, and he did not look back as he picked up his long black greatcoat and shrugged it on, hearing the reassuring crack of synth leather as it adjusted and molded to his body. He raised a hand in a gesture that might have passed as a goodbye, and then shouldered past the doors to the apothecarian chamber. It abutted the central mortuarium of Bastion P, and he emerged into the gleaming chrome of that chamber. He could see his distorted reflection in the cryofixed drawers, his dark hair close-cropped and graying at the temples. His skin was ruddy despite the chill beneath the station. His eyes, pale blue, caught the lumen light of the mortuarium, and Drask could make out the ring of red gold that marked the active iris implant. That'll take some getting used to, he thought with a soft chuckle. Servitors trundled into the room, long maglifters stretched out behind them in place of arms as they heaved the unliving cargo into the room, waiting for Amelia or one of her acolytes to examine them or assign them a berth. They stared ahead, unthinking and unaware. If they noted their grey-skinned cybernetic reflections in the surface of the drawers, they gave no indication. As dead, for all intents and purposes, as the bodies they transported. Who had they been? He wondered sometimes as he traversed the many floors of the bastion, whether cornered in technical areas such as this or watching from the sanctity of his desk space, he had watched them going about their business. Had they been sanctioners past their prime? Acolytes? Or helots who had failed to make the grade and ascend into the ranks? Or were they, as so many were, criminals themselves? Lobotomized, reworked, shaped for service eternal. Drask suppressed a shudder and moved past the cyborgs. They did not react, merely pivoted and laid their charges upon the examination tables with a hydraulic hiss of effort. Drask scrolled through the case file again. Quite a ways up district, as it happened. The active location for the case was a few streets away from the outer quadrants of the Risian Commercia. He had been considering taking the Mactrins, but at that much of a remove, a ground car might be the better option. Drask suppressed a sigh as he headed out of the mortuarium, up the cold granite stairs and into the bustle and never-ending tumult of the bastion's central hub. With any luck there would be a spare vehicle for him to requisition. Before he paused, catching the thought. Before the silver coin, he would have simply soaked the indignity, but the world was changed now. He was noticed again, and things were expected of him. And there were the wounds, of course. The ache of old scars across his stomach where the knife had bitten. Where the man who had been his mentor, who had been his friend, had tried to kill him. The wounds ached even to think of it. An itching, burning whisper of memory and pain. By the end, Alexius had been less than himself. He had become a thing, a ghoulish, broken reflection, and killing him had been a mercy. Such thoughts had haunted him since the incident. The bugged necessity of it. I did all I could, he whispered, and the words were lost beneath Thedinov. The bastion. I did my duty.